"I'll kill you if you even dare to look at me again." The cop roared, his rough hand gripping the 72-year-old woman's silver bun as he slammed her face onto the coffee-stained table. He sneered, his breath reeking of toxic authority, while his other hand rested casually on his holster, confident that in the town of Millford he was the law. But then the air froze. A hand as hard as cold steel clamped onto his shoulder. Towering behind him was no terrified civilian, but Admiral Nathaniel Reed, a living legend of the Navy SEALs, a man whose name alone commanded the respect of the highest ranks at the Pentagon. From a cowardly assault in a diner on Christmas Eve, the tables had completely turned. The officer didn't know that this man hadn't come just to pick a fight. He had come to dismantle the entire corrupt empire of NorthBridge and Sheriff Marks, exposing crimes that had been buried beneath the white snow for far too long. Can a lone soldier triumph over a systemic rot, or is taking down this man just the first step into a deeper level of hell? If it were your grandmother or mother being assaulted and threatened in the middle of a diner, what would you do? Leave a comment, and don't look away, because the Admiral's wrath is about to descend and the price will be absolute. Christmas in Millford at first glance looked warm and lovely. Red and gold lights lined both sides of the street, and every house played soft holiday music, like a tradition passed down from their grandparents. But for black people living here, the season never truly felt joyful. They walked down the sidewalk with their heads slightly lowered, eyes fixed straight ahead, not daring to glance at a patrol car, not even for a second. Parents told their kids things that might sound like jokes elsewhere, but were survival rules in Millford. If you see a cop, stand still. Don't run. Don't ask questions. Don't make them upset. The police in this town gave people the same feeling as an approaching thunderstorm. You never knew when lightning would strike, but you were sure your house would be the first. Sunset Diner sat right at the intersection next to the town's big Christmas tree, where folks usually stopped to eat after church. Daisy Moore had worked there nearly her whole life. She wore a faded purple blouse, her arms thin, her frame small, moving slowly but steadily, trying not to disturb the quiet as she walked between tables. Everyone knew Daisy was gentle and patient, so gentle that she once witnessed something awful and stayed silent. She said she had seen a cop yank a young man out of his seat at the diner just because he looked at them a little too long. She saw a cop force a kid to press his face to the table and say, "Sit there with that attitude, and I'll show you what happens." No one stepped in, and Daisy understood why. The one who spoke up would be next. The one stopped while driving, the one asked for papers, the one threatened over some tiny excuse. She had been a victim too, her shoulder dislocated after someone yanked her just for dropping a spoon. At her age, what Daisy feared most was someone's eyes turning toward her, especially a cop's eyes. Millford police were known behind their backs as the Skin Patrol because of how they looked at black people like they were criminals who hadn't been caught yet. They stood on the curb with hands on their hips, faces blank, but eyes constantly scanning. They asked black people irritating questions like, "What's the rush?" or "You got a reason to be here." But with rich white folks, their tone changed. "Need any help, sir?" The difference was so clear that even children noticed. Black residents said they'd been pulled over despite driving the speed limit. One elderly woman said she was stopped 3 times in 2 weeks just for walking to the market in the evening. The police never said she did anything wrong, just kept repeating, "Where do you live? What are you doing out this late?" In Millford, black people knew they were always on the suspect list, even when they were just living their lives. Someone once said, at the diner, "Around here, 3 seconds of eye contact is enough to make someone hate you." The story of the missing man began spreading around town the week before Christmas. Marcus Hall, an IT worker at NorthBridge, was quiet, diligent, and never caused trouble. One day, co-workers noticed him looking worried. He said there were a lot of things not right in the server duplicate files, edited data body cam footage, disappearing exactly when complaints were made. He said one sentence that people couldn't forget. "This is bigger than I thought." That night, he texted someone, "Tomorrow at 6, meet me at the diner. I have to hand this over." The next morning, his car was found by the roadside. Doors locked, keys still in the ignition. NorthBridge announced that he had resigned voluntarily. No one believed it. Someone coming back from the market whispered to Daisy, "They say he knew too much." The rumor spread fast. People talked, but always in low voices, careful not to be overheard. Millford lit up every night with hundreds of decorative lights, but for the people living there, especially the black community, each day was covered in a fog of fear that never lifted. They didn't trust the police. They didn't believe the system would protect them. Daisy knew this better than anyone. She came to the diner every morning, poured coffee, listened to the doorbell, and watched the police walk in with that overconfident stride like they owned the place. She didn't dare look them in the eye, just bowed her head and served. People talked about Marcus going missing. They talked about cases being buried, about the way cops looked at them like they were trash. All of it was built into a fear no one named but everyone carried inside. In Millford, things looked pretty, but living there was exhausting. And that night, as the wind passed through the strands of Christmas lights, people began whispering that something was about to blow up because the evil in this town had been swelling for too long. Daisy heard someone mutter while she was clearing a table late in the evening, "Something's going to happen. I can feel it." She didn't fully understand what they meant, but felt a chill in her gut. Not the chill of winter, but the feeling of someone who's lived their whole life in fear and knows that when fear reaches its peak, everything spills over like flood water. And no one expected that night to be the beginning of it all. There's one thing everyone in Millford understands, even if no one dares say it out loud: everything in this town revolves around 3 people: Damon Cross, Celia Thorne, and Blake Rowan. On the surface, Millford has police, a security firm, law enforcers, and oversight bodies. Sounds like a system that works. But those who've lived here long enough know it's not a system, it's a noose that tightens a little more each day around poor folks and people of color. And the hardest part is everyone knows it, but no one dares touch it. They tried before, then learned to stay quiet. They're not stupid. They just want to stay alive. Damon Cross, chief of Millford Police, is the face of that noose. Cross is tall and broad, and his voice always sounds like he's yelling, even when he's just asking for the time. He likes to intimidate people with his stare and get uncomfortably close until they lose their nerve. Poor folks shrink around him. Black folks look at the ground. Everyone knows Cross has a hair-trigger temper. If he doesn't like your face, he'll find a reason to charge you. If you're weak, he'll push you down. Once, he stopped an elderly black man just for standing too long in front of a convenience store. When the man explained his legs hurt, Cross snapped, "This isn't your place." The way he said things like that, it made people angry, scared, and hopeless all at once. No one could win against him in this town because someone always had his back. Celia Thorne, director of NorthBridge, is the one behind that backing. Most Millford residents rarely see Celia, but anyone who works near local government knows her well. Celia's the type who doesn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone chills you. She treats Millford like an open vault. Her company signed a deal to supply the town's security systems, then tacked on a dozen additional services. Police data surveillance cameras all over town, every officer's body cam, all of it runs through NorthBridge. To Celia, Millford isn't a community to protect. It's a steady revenue stream. She sees poor people, especially black people, as security risks, folks who need close monitoring to avoid trouble. She said that in a public meeting, like a joke, but with a face like stone. The black residents in the audience clenched their fists, unsure whether to feel more angry or more sad. Blake Rowan is the sharp point of the triangle. He's younger than Cross and has a far meaner streak. Cross scares people with his power. Rowan scares them because he enjoys their pain. He patrols the town like he's hunting. If you look like someone he hates, he doesn't need a reason. Someone said he stopped them just for carrying a dark-colored shopping bag. He said, "Look suspicious." A student once got held outside school because he walked too fast. Rowan's voice dripping with mockery. Everyone in Millford knows his catchphrase, "I create the problem, then I solve it." Just hearing it makes black residents flinch. Some were solved by having their teeth knocked out. Others were forced to kneel in parking lots. Every report non-compliant. Rowan took joy in it like a kid smashing toys. The part that really suffocates people is how these three are tangled together. Cross spreads the fear. Rowan delivers it. And Celia, high above, controls the data to make sure everything stays in line. If the cops touch someone, Celia has the power to edit or erase the footage. When residents file complaints, the video disappears. Evidence vanishes. The story flips. Everyone suspects something's rotten in NorthBridge's servers, but no one's allowed to look. People whisper that police body cams can be disabled remotely, but there's no proof. Then Marcus Hall went missing and people started piecing things together. Marcus was an IT guy at NorthBridge, quiet but well-liked. He once told a close friend he'd seen videos being cut at moments they shouldn't be. He said the raw footage didn't match the edited versions, like someone was hiding something big. In a secure folder, he'd found files marked with codes he'd never seen. He saw Rowan's name linked to several deleted videos. Marcus said, "I think they're doing something wrong. I need to talk to the right person." Then he vanished. His car was still there, street light reflections on the windshield. A sealed water bottle was still in the driver's seat. Everything stopped right when he was about to speak up. News of Marcus's disappearance spread fast. No one said it loud, but everyone whispered. Daisy overheard a customer murmur, "They cleaned him up." The fear crept in, silencing the town even more. It felt like the calm before a storm, the air tight like a drum skin. Everyone knew something was wrong, and every road led back to the same three names: Cross, Celia, and Rowan. Each of them had a hand in building the chokehold around Millford, a hold that always squeezed the poor and the black the hardest. That night, Daisy was wiping tables at the diner when the wind pressed hard against the glass. The Christmas lights outside trembled as if they might fall. A customer stood paid and said softly, "Doesn't feel like a quiet night." Daisy looked toward the door, her heart heavy like it knew what was coming. Millford had been a pressure cooker for a long time, and that night the lid started to shake. Luther Grant received the hard drive on a cold afternoon while sitting in a rental car parked on the edge of town, the kind of spot where anyone passing by would just assume a stranger had pulled over to check a map. The person delivering it didn't get out of their car. They just rolled down the window, tossed the small USB drive onto the passenger seat, and sped off like someone was on their tail. Grant picked it up and knew right away this wasn't ordinary data. The drive was light, but it made his palm feel heavier. It held something that scared the courier enough not to stop for more than 5 seconds. Grant opened his laptop, plugged it in, and the files that appeared made him frown. Internal emails between Celia Thorne and two familiar names, Damon Cross and Blake Rowan. No pleasantries, just short, blunt, direct lines about adjusting data, reframing reports, and making sure body cam footage doesn't cause problems. The way they talked, erasing evidence, sounded like routine work. Then he opened a folder labeled Flagged. Inside were strange banking transactions, large sums moving from NorthBridge accounts to personal ones out of state. Some lines were tagged premium services, a dead giveaway that they weren't even trying to hide the fact that they were funneling security funds into their own pockets. Grant read every line, his face unmoved, but his eyes grew sharper with each word. One section was more formal, a message from Marcus Hall sent to an external email address. It reported that footage from last night's incident has been altered and that 2 unauthorized data accesses occurred at dawn. Grant instantly realized Marcus was the same man people had been whispering about, the one who'd recently gone missing. He hadn't quit his job. He had discovered exactly what those 3 had buried deep in the system. Then Grant opened one last file, the one Marcus had marked urgent. It read, "They'll clear the path by any means. I have to get this to someone with the power to touch them." Grant's phone buzzed while he was halfway through the file. The message came from an unknown number. Just 2 sentences. "They won't spare anyone. Meet me at Sunset Diner." It was a prepaid number, no name, no photo, no trail. Grant stared at the screen, a familiar chill running down his spine. The kind of feeling you get when you've seen too many people vanish after brushing up against the wrong power structure. Messages like this are never jokes, and the sender with such short, clipped words was clearly being squeezed from all sides. Grant hadn't come to Millford for the first time. He had passed through years ago and remembered it as peaceful to the point of dullness. But this time, as he drove closer to Sunset Diner, the town carried a different scent, the kind that hung over places where people survived on endurance and silence. The diner appeared with strings of Christmas lights under the awning, their soft yellow glow swaying in the wind. It looked ordinary, but Grant had worked too long to believe in appearances. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his coat, and walked straight in. The doorbell rang. A few customers turned to glance at him, then quickly dropped their gaze like the reflex of someone who's learned not to get involved. Grant scanned the room for the person who sent the message. The instructions had been last table by the window, and there it was. The table had 2 chairs, but one was empty. The opposite chair was slightly askew, like someone had gotten up in a rush. A napkin lay on the floor beneath it, still unfolded. Grant walked over without saying a word. On the table, a cup sat tipped on its side, the coffee inside still warm. That told him more than any note could. Someone had just been here, was about to meet him, and either ran or was taken before they could speak. Daisy Moore saw it all from the counter, but said nothing. She'd seen enough in her life to know something was deeply wrong. Grant touched the cup, felt its warmth, then looked toward the front door. The diner was still as quiet as always, but something in the air felt tight, like someone had just bolted out the door or been led out or forced into silence. Grant sat down, placed the hard drive on the table, and began piecing things together in his mind. Marcus had wanted to meet him in person to hand this over, not just send it. That meant Marcus knew he was being watched. And now, seeing the empty chair, Grant believed he'd been intercepted, either inside this diner or just outside. If that was the case, those 3 had gone deeper than Grant had thought, and they knew who Marcus was trying to reach. He looked toward the corner by the window. There was a faint shoe print on the tile, pointing outward. No signs of a struggle, but the trace of urgency hung there. A napkin had fallen, its creases still intact, meaning Marcus had stood up so quickly he didn't even push his chair back. It all felt like someone had been called to the door by a threat or a command. Outside, the headlights of passing cars rolled by steadily, but Grant knew one thing for sure. In a town like this, when someone disappeared and no one heard a sound, it meant they'd been shut down at the root. Grant didn't feel afraid, but he did feel the heavy, familiar weight he'd known too many times walking into places full of buried secrets. People like Cross and Celia didn't leave traces easily. They erased, they cleaned, they snapped files like dry branches. And someone like Marcus, once he dared to speak, was always the first piece removed from the board. He sat for a moment, then stood up and walked to the door. Sunset Diner was so quiet that he could hear a spoon tap in a glass of water. Someone whispered behind him. He was just a little too late. Grant heard it clearly, and that only confirmed what he already knew. What he was up against wasn't just some corruption in a police office. It was a dirty network, wide and hidden, and the first person to push back had already been taken. Grant opened the door and stepped outside, leaving behind behind the still warm cup, the last piece of proof that someone had tried to call for help and had been stopped just one door away from the truth. Sunset Diner in the evening was usually filled with the sounds of conversation forks tapping plates and kids asking for more pie. But tonight, just after Luther Grant left the empty seat where Marcus was supposed to be, the air felt different. The diner was crowded, almost every seat taken, but the volume had dropped so low it felt like someone had told the whole room to keep quiet. Each table spoke only in brief, broken whispers, loud enough to hear, but never clear enough for anyone nearby to understand the words. Every so often, a customer glanced out the window, their eyes tightening the moment they spotted a police car passing by. They looked at it like it might turn around storm inside and turn anyone into the next target. People who'd lived in Millford long enough had that reflex a glance, then eyes down. The reflex of someone who's been through too much to believe explanations can fix anything. Daisy Moore moved between tables with a tray of drinks, her small frame slightly hunched like she was trying to hide something. Her left wrist was bruised and swollen from being yanked hard a few days ago. She pulled the sleeve of her purple blouse lower than usual, covering the discolored skin, afraid someone might see and ask. People in Millford understood these were things you didn't ask about, didn't stare at. Daisy didn't want pity, didn't want to make anyone worry. She just wanted to quietly finish her shift and get home in one piece. Still, every step she took trembled slightly, like any sound in the diner could signal trouble. What made her the most tense was the presence of Mallory Dane. Mallory stood blocking the back door, leaning against the wall arms, crossed like she owned the place. Her police uniform looked brand new. Her shoes polished to a mirror shine, her face blank. But her attitude spelled out in bold the type who treated intimidating civilians like part of the job. She looked at everyone with a kind of disdain, as if every person in the diner was inconveniencing her. Every time a customer walked toward the kitchen to pick up a takeout order, Mallory gave them a slow, once-over, head-to-toe enough to make them change course or return to their table unfinished. The feeling was like being stalked by a cat in the dark, ready to pounce if anyone moved the wrong way. Daisy knew Mallory wasn't in the diner by coincidence. She almost never patrolled this part of town and definitely didn't linger this long. Something was going on out there, something that made Mallory want to post up here. Daisy glanced at Grant, saw him sitting in the corner just before he stood to leave. She had a strong feeling Mallory was watching him too. As Daisy handed a customer their drink, her hand slipped slightly, causing the water to ripple. The customer looked at her with quiet sympathy, then let out a soft sigh, the kind that felt like a wordless piece of advice. Don't let them get to you. The customers in the diner stayed in their seats, taking small bites, sipping water in tiny sips. Some left their glasses untouched for nearly an hour. Some held their forks with stiff hands, unsure how to bring the food to their mouths. Everyone looked tense, but what tightened them even more were the glances exchanged between tables. Just a quick look, but it carried 3 clear messages. Don't start anything. Don't look the police in the eye. Don't speak too loudly. The children, sitting with their parents, were quieter than usual, holding pieces of bread without chewing. Their mothers placed gentle hands over theirs, soft but firm enough to signal behave. Grant watched it all from his seat near the door. He'd been in war-torn cities, sat in unsafe neighborhoods, and walked the line between life and death. But there was a kind of silence. He always recognized the silence of a place where people feared those in uniform more than they feared criminals. Millford had exactly that kind of silence. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the next bad thing to happen, like still water before the wind hits. Daisy returned to the counter, set down a tray, and lightly rubbed her wrist. She looked toward Mallory, then quickly looked away, afraid her glance might be taken as disrespect. She knew one wrong look at the wrong time was enough for Mallory to step over, say something cutting, then write in her notebook that Daisy was being disruptive. Daisy didn't want that, especially not tonight, when the tension in the diner felt heavier than usual. She touched the coffee cup Marcus had left that afternoon, the same one Grant had checked when he came in. She could feel that whatever happened to Marcus was keeping people up at night. His disappearance was something no one dared speak aloud, yet it stood there in front of everyone like the shadow of someone who hadn't quite left. One small detail caught Grant's attention, the way Mallory looked every time the front door opened. She sized up each person who entered as if trying to judge who might cause trouble, and, what stood out, she looked more closely at the black customers. If a middle-aged white man walked in, Mallory's posture loosened. If a black person entered, she stood straighter, her eyes tracking every move. Daisy noticed all of it, and her hands trembled more. She didn't need anyone to explain. She'd lived her whole life in Milford. She knew Mallory was waiting for something, or someone. Grant left the diner with the sense that Sunset Diner had turned into a storm shelter, but not for the rain outside. It had become a place where people braced against the storm, wearing uniforms, the storm everyone knew was forming, but no one could stop. As the door closed behind him, Daisy looked at the last table where Marcus was supposed to sit and stayed silent. She had a feeling that tonight wasn't the end of it. Milford was holding a secret about to explode, and all the averted eyes in the diner were just the first signs of the storm, waiting for someone to set it off. Blake Rowan walked into Sunset Diner like it was his backyard, a place where everyone was expected to step aside and clear a path. No one said a word, but the way eyes darted away and shoulders shrank spoke volumes about what people were thinking. Daisy Moore was carrying a tray past him when Blake suddenly stuck out his leg, stopping her in her tracks. The coffee cup on the tray tilted slightly, a few drops splashing onto the edge of his shoe. Blake looked down, frowned, then looked up at Daisy, like this was the moment he'd been waiting for all night. He shoved the tray hard, tipping it completely. The coffee cup hit the floor and shattered, the sound cracking through the diner and making everyone flinch. Blake growled, his voice cutting through the tension. "Spill something on my uniform and you're gonna jail. You hear me?" He spoke like Daisy had done it on purpose, like anyone who got his clothes dirty deserved punishment. Daisy opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could say a word, Blake stepped closer and grabbed her hair so hard her head snapped down. Her neck twisted at a sharp, painful angle, and she had to raise a hand to keep from falling. The gray strands caught in his hand looked like something he had every right to pull, yank, and twist as he pleased. She let out a small gasp, not loud, but loud enough that everyone in the diner heard it. The customers who saw it happen turned pale. A man at a nearby table slammed his fork down, but his wife immediately grabbed his arm. Everyone wanted to speak, to stand up, to grab Blake by the collar and pull him off Daisy. But everyone also knew exactly what would happen next. Their lives would be shredded in a matter of hours. They'd get flagged, stopped, charged, their stories twisted into something they couldn't untangle. People watched with their whole bodies tense, eyes burning, but their feet stuck frozen to the floor. Daisy tried to stand back up straight, hands shaking as she clutched her apron, but Blake didn't let go. He yanked again, harder this time, like he needed to prove he could. Then he leaned in close, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You're old. Stay home. Stop getting in the way of people doing their job." He said it like Daisy wasn't even human, just an object in the way. She took a short breath, her eyes slightly wet, but she stayed quiet, knowing that saying anything would only make things worse. Mallory Dane stood just a few steps away, notebook still in hand. She didn't step in, didn't stop him. She just wrote everything down as if it were a normal shift. Mallory opened her notebook and jotted something down large enough for nearby customers to read: resisting, obstruction of a public officer. The way she wrote it sounded like a sentence already decided, no questions, no need for explanation. Daisy saw those words and felt her heart drop. Resisting what? Obstructing who she hadn't even said a single word. Blake let go of her hair, but left his hand on her shoulder for one more second, like a reminder of who was in control. Then he nudged a shard of the broken cup aside with his boot and said loud enough for the whole diner to hear: dirty floor. What kind of of work is this?" No one answered. Daisy bent down to pick up the pieces, her hands shaking so badly the porcelain clicked together in her palm. She couldn't even get out the word sorry, even though it had lived on her tongue for years. A group of college students sitting in the corner exchanged looks like they were about to get up, but then they saw Mallory glance their way. That look alone was enough to shut them down, heads turning down as if nothing had happened. A man beside them clenched his knit cap in his hand. His lips pressed so tight they turned pale. His wife rested her hand on his shoulder and whispered something too soft for Daisy to hear, but the feeling was clear. Don't be stupid. People in this town had said that too many times already to their kids, to each other, to themselves. Daisy gathered the shards of the glass into a cloth and stood up, the purple scarf wrapped tightly around her wrist to cover the bruise. She stepped back slightly, avoiding Blake's eyes, even though he was still standing there, watching her like a predator, deciding whether to strike again. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to keep her hands from shaking, tried to keep her face from showing the pain. Everyone in the diner followed her every movement, as if they too could feel the sting in her neck from when she was yanked down. Blake turned to Mallory. "Write it down." She instigated the conflict. Mallory nodded coldly and shut the notebook. That motion felt like a door slamming in the face of someone innocent. Daisy felt her legs go light, as she might collapse at any moment. But she stayed standing because she knew if she fell here, they'd say she was faking and things would only get worse. No one in the diner touched their food again. They sat still, like statues, eyes turned away, lips pressed tight, hands stiff on the table. The air was thick enough to choke on. Everyone wanted to do the right thing, wanted to pull Daisy to their side, wanted to slam the table and speak up. But in Millford, doing the right thing usually came with too high a price. They had seen too many try and fail. Their names vanished from jobs, vanished from housing lists, vanished from clean records. Daisy took another step back as Blake moved half a step forward. She gripped the edge of the table to stop her hands from trembling, not because she feared Blake alone, but because she knew he stood for an entire system no one could win against. A customer nearby whispered, "Poor woman," but so softly even the ceiling fan drowned it out. Daisy bowed her head, feeling a heavy layer of exhaustion fall across her back. This wasn't the first time she'd been treated like this, but tonight, the looks from Marcus, from Mallory, the strange message, the empty chair, everything told her that this night was slipping into something much deeper. Blake finally walked away from the counter, but his eyes still swept over everyone, a silent warning. The townspeople lowered their heads even more. Mallory still stood by the back door, cold as stone. Daisy stood in the middle of the diner, gently squeezing her wrist, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. Something had just happened, right in the open, and no one dared to step in. Everyone understood that, and it was that very understanding that made the diner fall into a silence heavier than any stormy night. Blake Rowan stood towering over Daisy as she had just insulted his entire bloodline when all she was doing was stepping aside to pick up the last shard of a broken cup. He looked at her like he wanted to tear her apart, his breath hitting her face like a blast of hot air. The diner grew quieter by the second, silent enough to hear silverware stopping mid-motion. Daisy bowed her head lower, trying to avoid his gaze, trying to make each breath as quiet as possible, but that only made Blake angrier. He hated that kind of quiet submission, hated when people didn't respond because then he couldn't yell louder to prove something, and so he did exactly that. Blake shouted a line that made the entire diner shake. "Look at me one more time, I'll kill you right here." He said it like killing someone was something he'd do if he got pissed off just enough. His voice was sharp, high, and shot into Daisy's face like a blow without a fist. The person sitting behind Daisy shrank back. A young man holding his phone jumped so hard he dropped his chopsticks. A mother by the window quickly covered her little daughter's eyes, afraid the kid would carry the image for weeks. Daisy was truly shaken now. She couldn't hide it anymore. Her neck, still sore from the earlier yank, had started to lock up, and her breathing came in broken bits. But she kept her eyes on the floor, staring at the tips of her shoes, careful not to be seen as having an attitude. She tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. She meant to apologize, the fear buried so deep inside her it had become instinct, but the words wouldn't come out. She gripped the edge of her purple apron to stop her hands from trembling, her palms cold with sweat. What scared her wasn't the threat itself, it was knowing he could do worse, and in this place no one could stop him except the sky. The people in the diner froze. Someone leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a better look, but their eyes were full of pain and fury. A middle-aged man touched his wife's shoulder gently, his pupils wide from the shock, his throat moving, but no words coming. Someone reached into their pocket to grab a phone, maybe to start recording, but the moment they lifted it, they dropped it right back down. Mallory had caught their eye. She stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching the scene like it was a stage play. Her half-smile was enough to make anyone thinking of filming shut their camera down without a second thought. Mallory liked this. She liked the feeling of power, the kind that didn't need action, just presence to silence a whole room. Her eyes scanned from person to person, sweeping the diner for any sign of someone about to react. When she saw a man clenching his fist so tight his knuckles had gone white, she raised an eyebrow slightly as if to say, "Go ahead, try it." The man looked away, chest rising sharply as he swallowed down anger with no place to go. Blake stepped in even closer, the toe of his boot almost touching Daisy's shoe. He leaned in, voice lower but colder. "You think I'm kidding?" That sentence made Daisy's knees go weak, but she kept her head down. She didn't dare look up, knowing if her eyes met his, he'd twist the story into something even worse. She shivered, but fought to stay upright, careful not to step back. He'd see that as resistance. In her head, all Daisy could do was hope anyone would cut in and stop this. But deep down, she knew how unlikely that was in Millford. A young woman sitting near the door seemed like she couldn't take it anymore. Her hands clutched a napkin, her face red with anger. Her friend kept tugging at her sleeve, shaking their head, glancing toward Mallory, then toward Blake. The two officers stood there like stone walls, blocking any thought of someone rising to their feet. A young man in the corner lowered his gaze but gripped his cup so tightly the knuckles on his hand turned white. The entire diner felt frozen, forced to watch something they all despised but couldn't stop. Blake straightened up, looking slowly around the room as if waiting to see if anyone would speak. He liked this, liked the feeling of pressing a whole room into silence, liked seeing people fear him the way they feared a sudden tornado outside. No one in the diner breathed too deeply. Every breath was short, careful. Some closed their eyes for a few seconds as if silently praying, hoping this would end before someone lost control. Mallory shifted her weight, twirling the pen in her hand, a thin smile still on her lips. To her, watching Blake threaten an elderly woman near 70 wasn't wrong, wasn't worth noting, just power being exercised. She glanced at Daisy, not with pity, not with annoyance, but with an assessing look, as if she were studying whether Daisy could still stay on her feet or would finally collapse. She wanted to see where the limits of fear lay in this place. Blake looked at Daisy like she was something small and disposable. He raised his voice one more time. "You remember my face real well, so next time you'll know to stay out of the way." That line hit like the final nail driven into the chest of the room, pushing everyone's spirits down one level deeper. Daisy swallowed hard, her ears buzzing from the noise in her own head, but she gave a small nod, just enough to end this before it went any further than she could bear. After that, Blake turned and walked away like the job was done, leaving behind a crowded room that had fallen completely still. No one dared speak up. No one dared breathe too loud. No one dared look in his direction. Daisy leaned lightly against the edge of a table, her hand gripping the hem of her purple blouse to keep the trembling from showing. Everyone sat motionless like they'd been glued to their chairs, and only when Blake walked out of the seating area did the room start to move again, but no one relaxed. They all knew that in Millford a death threat could drop in the middle of the day and nothing would happen. And the night Daisy was pushed to her limit still wasn't the end of what was coming. The door of Sunset Diner, old and loose on its hinges, usually made a soft sound whenever it opened. But that night, the creak rang out, long and clear like someone had pulled it on purpose to make sure everyone heard. The diner, after the chaos Blake had just caused, was locked in a silence so thick that even the smallest sound startled the room. When the door creaked open, it was like the entire place got its breath squeezed out for one instant. Daisy stood hiding behind the edge of the counter, one hand still wrapped around her neck where the tug had left its mark. Blake had just turned his back when the sound made him frown and glance over his shoulder, the reaction of someone who had just finished scaring someone and now heard something unexpected. Mallory looked 2 shoulders slightly tensing like someone ready to shut down whoever dared to step in. The man who entered wasn't local that much, was obvious at first glance. Luther Grant stood in the doorway, tall, solid, his moss-green uniform catching the reflection of Christmas lights from outside. It wasn't the green of Millford police or security guards. It was a deeper, calmer green, the kind that carried an authority that made people fall silent on instinct. His coat was thick from the cold, but the faint gold stripes on the shoulder instantly changed the air in the diner. The people nearest the door saw 2 insignias catch the light as he stepped fully into the dim glow, as if even the diner itself understood it needed to hush. Grant said nothing as he stepped onto the first floorboard, but the way he stood made several people in the diner tighten their stomachs. In Millford, folks had seen all kinds of cops, the loud, the aggressive, the weekend reservist, the mall guards, but someone like Grant, whose mere stillness could reset the rhythm of a room, was so rare it felt familiar in a way that confused them. A few of the oldest customers at the last table exchanged quick glances, like they recognized something in the way he stood, the stance of someone who had served long, had discipline in their bones, someone who didn't need to speak to be clearly above the rest. The ceiling's Christmas lights reflected off Grant's shoulder as he stepped farther in the light, sliding over his gold insignia and catching on his sleeve, pulling everyone's gaze without letting them blink. No one knew who he was, but everyone knew he wasn't ordinary. His presence wasn't loud, it was a kind of stillness that made the whole place hold its breath. Even the soft scrape of a chair in the corner was swallowed by it. A woman by the window placed her hand gently over her chest, a reflex to the kind of presence that made your heart stutter for a second. Blake, mid-shrug on his way out, stopped halfway. He didn't have the wary look the others had. Instead, he tilted his head with the kind of measuring look you give a minor inconvenience. But what made him pause wasn't Grant's entrance, it was the room's reaction to it. Blake wasn't used to people looking at anyone else with that kind of weight in their eyes. He looked around and saw an old woman clutching her bag tight, an elderly man standing stone still, and Daisy half hidden behind the counter, but with her gaze fixed on Grant. The shift in atmosphere happened so fast that Blake felt a small imbalance he couldn't quite name. Grant stood at the door for a few seconds, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who had entered far more dangerous spaces than this. He didn't linger on anyone, just enough to register the scene, and then his gaze rested on Daisy for a single beat. It was a gentle look, simple, but it made Daisy exhale without realizing she'd been holding her breath. She tugged at the sleeve of her purple blouse like she could hide the trembling, but Grant's eyes didn't hold pity. They looked more like he was checking whether she was still standing. Blake's frown deepened. He squinted at Grant, head to toe. He didn't recognize the insignia, didn't understand the rank. All he saw was another man in green, walking right in the middle of what he thought was his job. He snorted, voice raspy and loud enough to be heard, "You lost, old man." His tone carried mockery dismissal and the absolute confidence that he was still the one holding power in this room. The people in the diner heard that line and their shoulders tensed. A young person sitting in the back corner whispered to a friend, "Did he really just say that?" The entire room looked at Blake the way you look at someone who's stepped right up to the edge of a cliff without realizing it. Mallory noticed it too, but her expression didn't change. Her lips curled slightly, like she was enjoying the scene that was about to unfold. She stood close to the back door, one hand resting lightly on her notebook strap, her eyes on Grant, trying to read what kind of man he was, but she couldn't, and that bothered her. Grant didn't reply. He took another step farther into the room, and the silence inside the diner thickened again. No one moved. No one chewed, no one dared to breathe too loudly. It felt like they had just witnessed something incredibly foolish come out of Blake's mouth, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The only thing certain in that moment was that the atmosphere had completely shifted the second Grant walked in, like he carried a different kind of air with him, something everyone felt but couldn't name. Blake dropped the hand resting on his hip slightly, his first instinctive reaction when he subconsciously realized this man wasn't like the ones he was used to intimidating. But years of arrogance kept him from backing down. He looked at Grant, lips curled in a half smirk, half dare, as if to say, "If you've got something to say, say it." But at that moment, the oldest people in the diner were still staring at Grant, their eyes wide the way people look when they realize they're standing in the moment before something big happens, something that could break the silence this town had lived under for too long. They didn't know his name. Blake didn't know who he was, but everyone in the diner, especially Daisy, saw one thing. Clearly, the door had just opened and what stepped through was not like any man they had ever seen in Millford. They all felt it. Millford, this tiny town, had stopped breathing the very moment his foot crossed the threshold. Luther Grant stood in the center of the aisle, his shoulder slightly tilted under the Christmas lights, unhurried, unshowy. With just one glance, he saw Daisy hiding behind the edge of the counter, her hand pressed to her neck like she was trying to steady the pain still pulsing there. Blake was still standing, face smug, like a man who had just finished something he thoroughly enjoyed. No one in the diner moved. Every eye was fixed tense, waiting to see what this unfamiliar man would do. Grant didn't rush forward, didn't try to assert himself. He simply stood, tall shoulders, square hands, lightly clasped in front of him. His face wasn't angry, but carried the kind of quiet command that comes from someone who has handled countless situations without raising his voice. Grant spoke after a few seconds. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the room where everyone was already holding their breath. Let her go. Just 4 words. No huff, no growl, but they dropped with the weight of someone used to giving orders in places where only gunfire and radio calls broke the silence. The person near the back door felt a chill run down their neck. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a man who had spent a lifetime speaking to subordinates, the kind of voice even military judges wouldn't ignore. Daisy suddenly turned her head, eyes widening for a beat, as if she couldn't believe someone had dared to say that in front of Blake. The entire room heard it and stayed perfectly still, afraid any loud movement might shatter the balance now hanging between the two men. Grant didn't move, didn't step forward or back. He didn't need to. He was the weight that now set the tempo in the room. When he said again, I said, "Let her go." His voice was still calm, but carried an extra edge of cold. Each word landed clean, steady, sharp, needing no decoration. Mallory Dane, who had been standing arms crossed at the back door with a smirk like she was watching a show, suddenly blinked. The Christmas light above caught on Grant's shoulder, and in that moment, Mallory realized what she had overlooked when he first walked in. She looked closer now, The rows of stars aligned the sharp seams of the uniform, and an insignia civilians might ignore, but anyone in the profession would recognize instantly. Her face went visibly pale. The smirk froze on her lips, uncertain whether to stay or vanish. The notebook in her hand slipped slightly, and she barely caught it before it dropped. She didn't say anything, but the tension in her eyes was unmistakable, the kind she thought she'd never have to feel in a town like Millford. Blake was different. He didn't recognize the stars, nor did he understand their meaning. All he saw was an old man in uniform walking in and daring to tell him to let go. His hand dropped slightly for a second, reacting instinctively to Grant's voice, but then his aggressive nature kicked back in and returned him to his usual bullying stance. He planted his hands on his hips and looked at Grant with a defiant glare. "Who the hell are you to talk like that?" He sneered, the kind of laugh from someone who believed the whole room was on his side, convinced this old man had just wandered in at the wrong time, right when Blake was putting on a show. The entire diner felt a chill crawl down their spines. An older man in the corner raised a hand to his mouth as if to keep a curse from slipping out. A young man looked down at the table fingers laced together as if bracing for Grant to be struck down right then and there. Daisy stood frozen gently, clutching the hem of her purple blouse like she needed to grip something just to stay upright. She knew all too well the feeling of watching someone unknowingly step in front of a loaded gun. Anyone who dared stand up to Blake usually didn't end well. She stared at Grant, worrying for him more than for herself. Grant didn't react immediately to the insult. He looked at Blake for a few seconds as if measuring the depth of this man's bluster. But Grant had seen men like Blake before, those who thought they were the center of the universe simply because they stood in a place where no one dared talk back. He didn't show anger, didn't let emotion reach his face. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes dropping to the insignia on his shoulder as if silently reminding himself, or maybe Blake, who he was. Blake didn't notice, but Mallory did. She swallowed hard. Her palm was sweating as it rested on the strap of her notebook. She knew she shouldn't be on Blake's side now, but she was already standing there. Grant spoke evenly, his voice dropping by just half a tone. "I said what I needed to say." The entire room heard it. They didn't know what rank he held. They didn't know the language of insignia, but they understood something far more primal. There are two types of power in this world: loud power and quiet power. And Grant had the second kind. No shouting, no slamming fists, just presence. And his presence changed the air from heavy to dense. Blake kept sneering, but the confidence behind it was starting to slip. He rolled his wrist a little, trying to stay in control. He didn't notice why Mallory was suddenly standing straight with tension in her shoulders. He didn't understand why the older folks in the room were now looking at Grant with a vague sense of respect. He ignored all those signs. In his head, Grant was just some stranger who had ruined his moment. Daisy looked at Grant, and for the first time that night drew a full breath. She didn't know who he was, but she knew something big was about to happen. Something she hadn't seen in all her decades of being cornered, silenced, and dragged into this cycle of fear. She could feel the shift in the room, like the moment before rain when the sky darkens but no drops fall. Grant stepped forward another half step, just enough for Blake to hear him clearly, without needing to raise his voice. "I said, let go of her." No exclamation mark, no growl in his tone, but the entire room heard it like the clang of a steel door shutting. No one knew what the next move between these two men would be, but everyone understood one thing. The man Blake had just called, "Who the hell are you?" was not like anything Milford was used to. And in the next 3 seconds, the whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first clash between the man used to crushing people and the man who just might be able to stop him with a single sentence. Blake didn't back down the moment Grant repeated, "Let her go." To him, that was a challenge. A stranger, older than him, was walking in right as he was putting on a show, daring to use a commanding tone with him in the very diner he treated as his own territory. He spun around, face flushing with anger, and stepped straight up to Grant's chest. The people in the diner saw his posture change and knew something bad bad was about to happen. Daisy, behind the counter, lightly bit her lower lip, her heart skipping with a sharp, painful thud. Blake grabbed Grant's collar with a hard yank strong enough to pull the fabric tight across his shoulder. He used his whole hand thumb digging into the edge of the collar, shoving and hauling as if he could crush Grant with brute force and rage alone. He snarled into Grant's face, a line that made the room go cold. "I'm talking to you." His breath hit Grant's face, thick with anger, and the arrogance he carried into every confrontation. He assumed, like always, that the man in front of him would step back, turn pale, or apologize just to stay safe. Grant didn't move. He didn't strike back, didn't grab Blake's hand, didn't stiffen like someone caught off guard. He simply tilted his head slightly to one side, just enough to turn Blake's grip into a clear act of aggression. The yank turned into a pull against empty space, making Blake slip forward half a step and leaving no doubt to anyone watching that Blake had made the first move. Half the diners felt their hearts jolt because something in Grant's posture said he understood the rules of this game better than anyone else in the room. An older man at a table near the door pressed his hand to his forehead and let slip the words he'd tried to hold back. My God, he just put his hands on an admiral. The line was low, almost a whisper, but it carried far enough to ripple across several nearby tables. When people caught the word, admiral mouths fell open in shock, hands bracing against tabletops to steady themselves. They didn't know all the ranks or structure of the military, but they knew this much: an admiral wasn't someone a low-level officer had any right to touch, let alone grab by the collar like a street thug. Mallory heard it and felt her heart drop a beat. She snapped her gaze back to Grant, really looking now at the stars on his shoulder. This time, there was no doubt. She knew she had chosen the wrong side at the worst possible moment. Her grip tightened on her notebook until her knuckles went white, her eyes fixed on Blake like she was watching a man dig his own grave. In all her years in Millford, she had never seen anyone dare to attack someone of that rank. Blake's stupidity in that instant surpassed even his brutality. Blake still hadn't realized what he'd done. Seeing Grant unmoved only made him angrier. He thought the old man was daring him. He shoved again, harder, but the force sent him sliding back half a step instead. Grant remained planted like a post driven into the diner floor, his gaze unchanged, his breathing calm, like someone watching something fall exactly where it was meant to. When Blake pulled his hand back to try a different angle, Grant lifted his chin slightly and said, "You've just created excellent evidence, slow and clear." The words landed as a stone dropped into water, heavy enough to send ripples through the entire room. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an angry reaction. It was the calm certainty of someone who knew he was in the right place, under the right rules, at the right time. From a nearby table, someone hissed through their teeth, "That's it." The people of Milford might not understand military procedure, but they understood one thing very well. When someone like Grant said that it meant the man who had just laid hands on him had written his own sentence. Blake paused for half a second, unsettled by Grant's confidence in a way he couldn't name. He looked around and saw a few customers avoiding his eyes, a few staring down at their tables, and Mallory standing frozen as she had nowhere left to go. The only thing keeping him clinging to his aggressive posture was habit years of believing he had all of Milford in his grip. But that night, for the first time, he felt control slipping from his hands, and he didn't understand why. Grant looked at Blake the way someone looks at a puzzle they solved long ago. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to act like a victor. He simply stood upright, smoothed the collar that Blake had wrinkled, then placed his hand calmly at his side. That stillness sent chills through the room. Those who had once been victims of Blake looked at Grant with a different kind of gaze, quiet hope, so real it caught in their throats. Daisy stood at the counter, her hand trembling slightly. She had been yanked, threatened, written up, and treated like a rebel for doing nothing. She stood there, watching Blake grab Grant's collar, then heard the words evidence, and she understood something far bigger than anything she had ever seen was unfolding in front of her. Blake took a step back, his eyes shifting from defiance to something harder to read, like he was realizing for the first time that he might have picked the wrong target. But his pride was still intact, still wrapped in the illusion that he could crush this old man like every victim before. He jerked his chin up and asked, "You threatening me?" His voice wavered slightly, though he tried to cover it. Grant didn't answer the question. He simply looked at Blake with the eyes of someone who had long since understood men like him. And in that crowded room, silence fell again like a thick blanket. Everyone knew what came next wouldn't be words. They were witnessing the meeting point between the familiar cruelty of Millford and the man who had just walked in carrying a whole different set of rules. The moment Blake chose to strike Grant, they knew would be the moment he'd wish he had stayed silent from the start. The watch on Luther Grant's wrist gave off a single soft vibration, a sound so faint only he could hear it. No one in the diner knew what it meant, but Grant knew exactly it was the signal confirming that the federal investigation team was in position. They were parked 20 miles outside of Millford, waiting for the precise moment he gave the go. They had search warrants, arrest orders, and a full case ready to blow open both NorthBridge and the Millford Police Department. Grant didn't glance at his watch. He simply tilted his hand slightly, as if adjusting the strap, a gesture so ordinary that no one could have guessed it marked the start of a night that would change this town for good. The diner was still just as full, but not a soul moved. Blake still stood close to Grant, hand gripping the collar of his shirt, though the grip had noticeably loosened. Daisy stood behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the shift in Grant's face as she'd just seen him turn from a calm observer into a man fully in control. Mallory was by the back door, her spine stiff like steel wire, face so tight with tension that the person nearest her could hear her swallow hard. She didn't know exactly what was coming, but with her years in the field she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer standing on safe ground. Grant looked at Blake for a second, then turned his face toward Mallory. His voice was even and low, not loud, but every word rang clear across the diner. "They're on their way, and they have a search warrant." That was it, but the sentence dropped like a stone right into the middle of the room. Not everyone fully understood the weight of it, but even the average person knew one thing: search warrant wasn't a phrase you heard in Millford, unless something big was about to explode. Mallory's eyes shot wide open. Her lips froze as if someone had slapped her across the face. She looked around the room, panic flooding her gaze, then back at Grant, trying to read whether this was a bluff or the real thing. But Grant's voice didn't carry threat, not the way Blake's did. It was a statement. Clean. Final. Blake heard the words, and his heart stopped for a beat. His hand let go of Grant's collar by reflex, not because he understood everything, but because his body reacted the moment it heard the word federal. He stepped back, half a pace, mouth open, but nothing came out. In those few seconds, all the power he had ever flexed in Millford felt like it had been ripped from his hands. He looked at Mallory, searching for some kind of backing, like waiting for her to say, "He's bluffing." But Mallory was in no shape to nod. She was trembling so badly her notebook tapped lightly against her hip as she lost control of her grip. The people in the diner looked at each other in a way they hadn't dared to in years. Their eyes no longer darted away, no longer hid behind menus, they opened wide. An old man in the corner froze mid-breath, his hand squeezing his cap until his knuckles turned white. Two college students near the door whispered, "Oh my God." Its real voices shaking, but laced with hope. A woman holding a small child looked at Grant like he was the door to something they'd stopped believing could ever come justice walking into this town. Blake narrowed his eyes, trying to look like he was still in control, even as his heart thudded out of rhythm. He stepped forward, trying to reclaim his stance. "Federal, what don't come in here spouting crap in my town." But even his voice trembled, the power gone, like a man trying to stay upright on ground that had just shifted under him. He didn't understand the buzz from Grant's watch. He didn't understand that a federal response team was waiting for a single trigger to move, and he definitely didn't understand that this wasn't some old man showing up to argue. This was a plan. This was the signal, and he was standing dead center in the storm. Grant didn't respond to Blake's words. Instead, he looked him straight in the eyes with a calm so steady it made Blake want to look away. Then Grant spoke the second sentence, the one that could cut the legs out from under anyone still clinging to aggression. They have the video, both the original and the deleted version. The entire room felt like the air had been sucked out of it in a single beat. Daisy raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Everyone knew how many body cam clips in Millford had turned out corrupted, lost, or unreadable. Everyone knew what people like Marcus had tried to say before they vanished. Mallory clenched her teeth, her eye twitching like she'd been shocked. She understood exactly what that meant. She knew the tools at NorthBridge could no longer shield them. She knew the video of Blake pulling Daisy's hair, the video of him issuing death threats, the video of herself standing there taking notes like an accomplice. All of it was now in the hands of someone with far more authority than this town. She stepped back, and the pen she'd been holding all night dropped from her hand. Blake looked around. This town had once feared him, had once folded every time he showed up. But tonight, he saw something he'd never seen before. People no longer looked at him with fear, but with the quiet expectation that he was about to be exposed. More heads lifted. A few people placed their hands on the table as if steadying themselves, but inside they carried a small fire. A fire Blake no longer knew how to put out. Grant stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, grounded. He didn't move forward, didn't touch Blake, didn't say anything extra. He simply observed, letting the shift in the room unfold on its own. And it did, clearly, undeniably, so much so that Blake felt like he'd just been shoved off the top of a hill he once believed no one could climb. The people in the diner understood exactly what was happening. Even if no one said it aloud, the hunter had been unmasked. No one was going to cover for him now. No report could spin this. No internal email could save him. Mallory was no longer standing by his side. There was nowhere left to hide. Their eyes turned toward Grant, not like he was some action movie hero, but like he was the only one strong enough to shut off the darkness that had sat on their lives for far too long. And in that moment, the silence in the diner was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of people witnessing the moment Millford began to change hands. The NorthBridge server was locked overnight, right as the federal team rolled their carts into the lot behind headquarters and unloaded equipment that no one in Millford had ever seen before. They didn't knock, didn't ask permission, didn't give long explanations. They went straight into the IT room, showed the search warrant to the internal cameras, and forced the system to cut all external connections. The data Celia thought she had deleted or buried in separate encrypted folders was under the hands of the federal tech team, no more secure than a thin sheet of paper covering a gaping hole. Files started popping up one by one, the word recovered lighting up non-stop like warning lights across the room. Outside, no one was allowed in except federal staff. What the people of Millford heard later sounded like fiction, but reality was clearer than any rumor. A technician sat in front of a large monitor, fingers moving fast across the keyboard, opening piece after piece of edited data. They restored civil rights reports, every log, every word, every strike-through to see the originals. They opened every body cam file the police department had marked as power lost or damaged during pursuit. As the video footage replayed, the tech room went completely silent, with only the sound of the keyboard getting heavier with each new frame. The footage wasn't corrupted by accident. It had been turned off at the exact moment someone was being beaten, and turned back on once police had scripted a new version of events. Timestamps didn't match. The audio cut off just as the victims were gasping for air. One clip from 7 months ago showed Blake pinning pinning a black teenager to the curb with a knee to his back, while the official report claimed the suspect fell on his own. Another file showed Damon Cross grabbing a woman's complaint and tossing it into the trash, though the report stated no form found. And there were many more files, one after another, lining up like evidence of a system rotten to its core, still painted over to fool the public. Among the recovered documents were a string of civil rights reports that matched exactly what residents had been saying for years. Altered forms, reversed descriptions, and phrases like "suspect resisted" were added only during moments with no surveillance. Anyone reading them could clearly see the editing had come from inside. The signatures on the reports all came from the same group, Rowan Mallory, and a few other officers. What stunned everyone most were the logs showing district court staff had received notices to not process push to next month temporarily closed. Millford hadn't been short on cries for help. It had been short on people willing to keep the truth untouched. The data kept coming. A long list appeared logging every time NorthBridge accessed body cam footage after a complaint was filed. Federal techs found the deletion method remote access, targeting specific footage, slicing it in two, then stitching it back into a signal loss segment. These clips had timestamps matching patrols involving Blake and Mallory. As they rewound each second, the blurred footage showed police uniforms hunched over someone's head, then the image vanished as the connection dropped. The more they watched, the clearer NorthBridge's deception became. Another folder opened, this time internal emails. The messages between Celia Thorne and the officers made the entire room stop for a few seconds. Push the files to next week, delete from section 11 to 12. He's making a big deal. Don't let the public find out. And one line made the entire tech team look at each other. He's already gotten his cut stick to the plan. Attached to the folder was a list of bank transactions showing payments made to someone no one in Millford had ever dared suspect, Judge Quentin Hale. His name appeared alongside many small but regular transactions, all labeled with the same note consulting fee. But these transactions didn't go through the court's financial system. They came directly from a NorthBridge account. One investigator leaned back in his chair and exhaled heavily as he read the list. If a judge had been receiving money from a company that sold security equipment to the town, then every lawsuit, every incident of police violence, every denied complaint wasn't just random or a minor error, it was part of a corrupt system that had been in place for many years. In the hallway, waiting area, a few residents who had heard rumors of the raid stood off to the sides as if afraid of getting caught up in it. They didn't know exactly what was going on, but the looks they exchanged were all the same. Part fear, part relief, like something heavy that had sat on their chests for too long was finally lifting. One person said, "Someone's finally looking into this." Another was more cautious and simply said, "Let's wait and see." But deep down, everyone knew when servers open all at once, when emails reappear, when videos are recovered, it means the glossy coat on this town is being peeled away strip by strip. Grant stood at the end of the hallway, hands folded in front of him, watching the tech team at work. He didn't say much, just asked about specific categories, key files. He knew exactly what was being uncovered, the thing Marcus Hall had tried to speak about before being pulled off the line. As the data began to show up in its raw form, Grant understood what the people of Millford had tried to explain in their short, desperate letters. They were cornered, suffocated, treated like a burden, and the system they were appealing to had long been in someone else's pocket. When an investigator came back and said, "We found the deposits for the judge," Grant didn't look surprised. He just gave a small nod and glanced down the hallway where the townspeople stood still as if waiting for a verdict. But Grant wasn't the type to make speeches. He simply told the investigator mark it as a priority. Then he turned back to the control panel, eyes locked on the list of connected names. What he was thinking then was the same thing the people of Millford had hoped for. All these years, there's nowhere left for them to hide. When the gloss is stripped away, what lies underneath isn't a collection of scattered secrets. It's a fully built system of abuse and power. And that night, for the first time in many years, the truth of Millford was no longer buried in empty files or signal-lost videos. It was showing up word by word, image by image, name by name. The people in the hallway looked at each other, their eyes small but bright, like the first candlelight in a town that had lived in darkness far too long. That night, no one in Millford could sleep. From the police station to City Hall, from the NorthBridge offices to the diners still lit up, the whole town felt like it had been flipped off the table. News of the federal team storming the server spread faster than any official report, and the first to panic wasn't the townspeople, it was Damon Cross. He called an emergency meeting right in his office, slamming the door so hard the glass shook. His subordinates lined up along the wall faces, paling as Cross slammed his hand on the table and roared like a cornered animal. How the hell did you let a tiny thing like this leak everywhere? One old guy walks in and you all fall apart. What the hell did I build this team for? His voice was thick, choking up with rage that had been simmering for too long. He threw a stack of files to the floor, papers flying, then kicked the chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. His face was flushed like he had a fever. No one dared speak, because they all knew the tiny thing he referred to was actually an entire system cracking beneath their feet. A young officer tried to say something. "Sir, they had a real warrant. I saw the red seal." He didn't get to finish before Cross pointed straight at him. "Shut your mouth. Say one more word and I'll have you on 12 weeks of night duty." Cross turned toward the window, looking out where the streetlight glinted off the federal vehicles parked at the end of the block. For the first time in years, he swallowed hard, like a man who realized the emergency exit had just been sealed shut. At that same moment, on the third floor of the NorthBridge building, Celia Thorne stood in front of 3 large monitors showing the entire server system. Her fingers kept typing override commands, but the screen displayed only one response: access denied. She clenched her jaw, took a deep breath, and tried another code, tried accessing through the backup route, tried bypassing using a technician's account, but everything was locked by the same bold white text secured under federal investigation order. She stood still for a few seconds, then slammed her hand against the desk edge, knocking over a cup. She had never imagined the day her own system would be locked away from her, right in front of her staff by people she'd always considered beneath her. A young engineer came in, face pale. "Director, they're asking us to leave the server floor. They brought escorts." Celia turned to him, her stare sharp enough to cut through. She didn't yell, but every word was like a blade. "I'm not going anywhere." But behind her, 3 federal agents were already waiting. Their faces gave no reaction to Celia Thorne's tone. She understood clearly that the respect others once had for her no longer held weight. She tossed her key card on the desk, turned away, her hand trembling just slightly, something she tried to hide. At that same time, in the holding cell of the police station, Blake Rowan completely lost control. His hands were cuffed to the bars, his face red with fury. At first he shouted, "Why the hell are you locking me up? I work here." But when the federal order came through confirming he was being held for questioning, he started slamming his knees into the door, kicking the wall, the sound echoing so loudly the dispatch room could hear every hit. The officer watching him had once feared him, but tonight his eyes showed exhaustion mixed with a quiet, buried satisfaction. The more Blake kicked, the more out of control he became, shouting incoherent things, the cuffs clanging against the bars. He no longer looked like the man who led patrols. He looked like an animal trapped in a cage about tobe closed. After a while, Blake collapsed into a chair, breathing fast and uneven. He muttered, "It's not supposed to be like this. I'm the one who deals with the people here. I'm the one." His voice faded, grew weaker, but his eyes stayed wide open, refusing to believe he was the one being held. The truth was, it had never crossed his mind that the whole system could turn on him, because all his life he'd been used to seeing the people of Millford keep their heads down. Tonight, for the first time in his life, he realized he was the one at the bottom. Mallory Dane was in a different state. She didn't lash out or scream like Blake, but her mind was racing so fast her hands couldn't keep up. She sat at her desk, staring at her notebook at the lines with Daisy Moore's name at the labels resisted, caused trouble. She remembered the moment Grant walked into the diner, the light on his shoulders, and his words, "They're coming." Every thought in her mind felt like another door closing her in. Mallory opened the drawer, picked up her car keys, then set them down again. Her hands were shaking too much to hold them. She stood up, took a few steps, then sat down again. In her head, there were two choices run from town that very night, or stay and face something she knew she couldn't withstand. She remembered every email Celia had sent, every call from Cross asking her to tweak files every time Blake forced her to falsify a report. She thought about how if she ran, they'd track her down, and her charges would be worse. If she stayed, the feds would question her about everything, and this time there was no one left to cover for her. Mallory put both hands on her head, took a deep breath, and said into the air, "I'm screwed." It was the only sentence she dared to speak that night. Out on the street, the people of Millford stood watching the cars with blue lights parked in front of NorthBridge headquarters and the police station. Many said they heard Blake smashing things inside, heard Cross screaming like a man about to lose everything, and in every house, even with the doors shut tight, everyone could feel that tonight wasn't like the nights before. No one dared to sleep, because some nights aren't for resting, they're for waiting for the end of an era that many thought would drag on for decades more. The clouded darkness over Millford was being torn apart, one layer, then another, and the whole town knew by tomorrow morning nothing would be the same again. Celia Thorne was ordered to leave the server room and brought down to the ground floor to work with the investigation team. She walked quickly, the sound of her heels echoing through the hallway as if to prove she still had some kind of authority, even though inside she knew that door of confidence had slammed shut the moment NorthBridge was locked. When she reached the reception area, she saw Luther Grant waiting beside a long wooden table. The overhead fluorescent light cast a straight beam down, but it didn't make him look tired. It made his presence sharper. Celia stopped, chin slightly lifted, assuming the stance she was used to taking with people she considered beneath her. "You think you understand this town?" Celia asked, her voice low but clipped, forcing each word out like a challenge, trying to make Grant feel like an outsider who didn't know how Millford really worked. She stood straight, arms crossed, showing the cold pride she'd used for years to keep others beneath her. In her mind, this was the last card, make him doubt his own judgment, make him hesitate, make him believe what he was seeing was just the surface of a town more complicated than he could ever grasp. Grant looked at her for a few seconds, his eyes blank, not curious, not moved. He stood like a post in the middle of the room, shoulders straight, head slightly tilted. He didn't step closer, didn't step back. He stayed where he was letting her question pass over him like a faint breeze. When he answered, his voice was so calm that some of the federal agents behind him thought he hadn't spoken at all. "I know what evil looks like when it dresses up as order." The sentence wasn't sharp like a knife, but its weight dropped right at Celia's feet, making her stumble half a step inside even though her legs stayed rooted in place. Her chest tightened in a way she didn't want anyone to see. She'd faced plenty of officials' investigators' threats, but Grant's words were different. They didn't threaten. They didn't provoke. They simply named exactly what she had built all these years. Celia looked straight into Grant's eyes, and for the first time that night, she saw no hesitation in his. This man wasn't here to negotiate, wasn't here to warn, and wasn't here to settle. He was here to end what she had twisted for too long. That truth made her tremble just slightly, a reaction she hated more than anything but couldn't stop. Her breath caught for a moment, and she realized she had just shifted from the role of rulemaker to the role of the accused. "You don't understand how complicated things are here," Celia said, her voice quieter now, tilted toward defense. "I kept this town safe." Grant didn't let her finish. He didn't need to hear an excuse he'd heard 100 times. "You kept a certain group safe," he said, eyes fixed on hers, and called the rest garbage to be cleared out. Celia froze. She knew then that he had seen it all, from the emails, from the videos, from Marcus's message. She had no gaps left to slip through. Every structure she built, every line she tried to hide, every secret she altered, was now laid bare in front of this man. An investigator stepped forward, voice soft but clear. "Director Thorne, you'll need to come with us." Celia turned her head, then looked back at Grant, searching his eyes for any sign she still had room to maneuver. But there was nothing, just quiet certainty. That silence hit harder than any evidence. It said the game was over. Celia took a long breath and lowered her arms. For the first time that night, she didn't square her shoulders or lift her chin. She looked like someone who knew there was no way back. "You don't understand," she whispered. Grant tilted his head, his eyes calm in a way that was more frightening than anger, because it held no hate, only truth. "I understand enough to know you shouldn't have the keys to any system again." Two investigators stepped forward. They didn't yank or shove, just extended their hands. A cold cuff clicked around Celia's wrist. The snap of the lock was dry and heavy. The whole hallway heard it. Celia didn't resist, didn't struggle, didn't protest. She knew this wasn't the moment to fight, and more than anyone, she knew every exit she had once used was now sealed shut. Grant didn't take his eyes off her as they led Celia away. He didn't look at her with the gaze of someone who had won, but with the eyes of someone who had buried a cycle of violence she had helped grow. As Celia passed through the doorway, her high heels tapped softly on the floor, each step echoing like a bell, marking the end of her reign. And in the hallway's stillness, something spread like a chill in the air, a feeling the people of Millford had hoped for over many years, but never dared believe the one who bent the law was now in handcuffs, and the one who upheld it stood firm in the center of its collapse. The federal team printed out the transaction statements page by page, stacking them into a thick pile placed in front of the investigators. Every transfer bore the mark of NorthBridge moving money into accounts outside the public system, and the name that appeared most often was Damon Cross. The amounts weren't large each time, but they were steady like underground water flow, enough to prove this wasn't a gift, but payment for maintaining order, as Cross defined it. When the final page was set on the table, an investigator slid the stack slightly toward Cross without saying another word. Just seeing his name listed as the recipient made everything clear enough. Cross stared at the papers, his face going pale, then flushing red with anger. He stood up from the chair, stepped back half a step as if to deny it, but his legs froze midway. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly cornered. The federal team then brought lower-ranking officers into the interrogation room one by one. The first was the young officer who had been shaking throughout the meeting the night before. He sat down, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the glass of water in front of him as if it were a lifeline. The investigator asked, "Did you write those reports yourself?" His chin trembled slightly, then he blurted out as if unloading a burden. "We were forced to falsify the reports." One sentence, but it was enough to open the door for everyone else. He described everything in detail. Cross standing behind him, Blake sitting nearby, Mallory adjusting every word in the logbook. Those who followed into the room gave similar statements. No one dared to stay silent anymore because they knew that staying silent now meant going down with Cross. An older officer said I wanted to back out, but they said if I did, they'd deal with my son first. That sentence silenced the room for several seconds. The statements that followed poured out like water from a broken dam, exposing truths the people of Millford had long suspected, but had never heard directly from those in uniform. The investigators took each testimony, recorded it, and passed it to the legal team to prepare for court. Every new statement was another nail in Cross's career, and he knew it. He stared through the interrogation room glass, his face gradually taking on the look of someone completely defeated. Mallory walked into the interrogation room like someone reaching the end of an exhausting road. She sat down, hands resting on her knees, her eyes no longer holding the arrogance or sharp edge she'd shown at the diner the night before. The investigator placed a file in front of her and opened the first page restored body cam footage, showing her taking notes while Blake pulled Daisy Moore's hair. Mallory took a deep breath, then looked up straight ahead. "I want to confess everything in exchange for a reduced sentence." She said it like someone finally setting down a weight she'd carried for far too long. No excuses, no evasions. She laid out every detail from orders to delete videos to fake reporting meetings to the times Cross forced her to sign files that had already been altered. Mallory said, "I knew this would fall apart one day, but I didn't think it would happen this fast." The investigator flipped to the next report, and she continued talking about the accounts Celia transferred money through, about emails instructing how to handle troublesome citizens, about NorthBridge paying under the label of service surcharges to buy the silence of certain officers. Every word she gave, even as an attempt to save herself, helped complete the case against the entire system she had once been part of. While Mallory was testifying, Blake Rowan was taken into solitary confinement. He screamed non-stop for the first 10 minutes like a man on the edge of madness, slamming his head into the door, kicking the walls, shouting, "You want me dead? Is that it?" An officer stood outside, watching him, rage his expression unchanged. Blake shifted from screaming to threatening. "I'll kill myself so you have no one left to prosecute." Hearing that the monitoring team immediately moved him to a safe isolation cell where he was loosely restrained to prevent him from harming himself. In that empty space, Blake sat there, breathing eyes wide but focused on nothing. He looked like someone who had just been stripped of the shell he'd worn with confidence for so long. Everyone in the station could hear him yelling, "This is your fault, you abandoned me. All of you abandoned me." But no one was listening anymore, because no one believed he was anything more than a filthy cog in a system that had already rotted through. Out in the hallway, a few lower-ranking officers stepped out of the interrogation rooms, their faces lighter, like people who had just dropped a burden they'd carried for a decade. They weren't proud of confessing, but they knew that if they stayed silent, they'd be dragged down with those who had forced them to take part. One officer whispered to a colleague, "At least this time, someone is listening to the truth." The other nodded, eyes drifting toward the street outside where the headlights of the federal vehicles still reflected off the damp pavement. The entire Millford system was being stripped bare. What had been hidden behind threats and forged documents was falling away layer by layer. Cross no longer controlled his subordinates. Celia no longer controlled the servers. Blake no longer controlled himself, and Mallory understood that running was no longer an option. Those who once stood at the top were being pulled into the light one by one. And across the town, for the first time in many years, that collapse didn't make people afraid, it let them breathe more deeply. The morning after the chaotic night, Milford Hospital was unusually crowded. It wasn't because of an accident or an outbreak, but because people were coming to check on Daisy Moore, the woman the whole town was used to seeing behind the diner counter in her old purple blouse. She lay in a minor emergency care room, her neck wrapped in gauze to ease the pain, when turning her hands, still trembling, but her eyes already alert. When the door opened, Daisy was surprised to see someone waiting in the hallway. A long line of people, all ages, stood silently, like they were waiting to see something they thought was gone, something they called kindness. A middle-aged woman walked in first, carrying a bag of fruit, and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't dare stand up yesterday." Daisy shook her head and held the woman's hand gently, as if to say she understood. One by one, the others stepped in, each placing something on the bedside table. A small bouquet, a box of soup, a card with shaky handwriting that said, "Thank you for holding on that long." Daisy read those words, and her tears soaked into the bedsheet. Tears not just of pain, but of relief. For decades, she had thought she was alone in her fear, People didn't just come to visit. Many began to talk. In the hospital lobby, where the plastic chairs lined the walls, townspeople gathered in small groups. They shared things they had always kept to themselves. An elderly man said Cross stopped me right in the street just because I asked for directions for my grandson. A young man said Blake slapped me right outside my house because I said I didn't do anything wrong. A black woman stood up her voice, rough but steady. Mallory put me on a watch list, even though I was just working night shifts. The stories flowed like a waterfall, each person sharing a little, not loudly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. They looked around, saw no police standing guard, and kept going. Some people trembled. Some fought back tears, but all of them let it out as someone had finally uncorked a bottle sealed for years. Grant was there in the lobby. He didn't step into the middle. He didn't raise his voice. He chose a chair at the far end of the row, holding a leather notebook, writing everything down. He didn't ask rapid questions. He just listened. When someone looked his way as if to ask, "Should I say this?" Grant nodded gently. His eyes didn't say much, but they were enough to reassure. "Go ahead, I'm listening." A man came and sat beside him, his wrist still bandaged from when Blake had slammed him to the ground a few months ago. "I filed a report 3 times. They said the file was lost," the man said. Grant wrote down every sentence, every date, every witness name. A teenage girl, about 17 years old, stepped up in front of him, gripping her phone tightly. "Mister, I have a video, but I've been hiding it because I was scared they'd find out," she said, her voice shaking. Grant didn't look at her like an interrogator. He looked like someone who wanted to help. "Let me see it," he said softly. She took a breath, handed over the phone, and felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Out in the hospital courtyard, a group of local residents began to gather. An older man stood at the center of the group, speaking with the voice of someone who had thought long and hard. "We should form an oversight committee, chosen by the people, elected by the people, to keep watch over the police. No more letting anyone do whatever they want." A woman next to him nodded firmly. "If not now, then never. We've let them walk all over us for too long." Some others agreed, some were still hesitant, but no one objected. Since news broke that the federal team had accessed the servers, the people of Millford understood that chances like this didn't come often. They wanted something that would protect them, not just another outsider swooping in to save the day. Grant stepped into the courtyard when he saw the group forming. He didn't interrupt, but stood close enough so they wouldn't feel intimidated. The older man asked him, "Will the feds let us set this up?" Grant replied plainly, "The law allows it. The power is in your hands." He looked at them for a few seconds as if to remind them that lasting change wouldn't come from the federal team, but from them when they stood tall on their own. The woman from earlier asked, "If we do set it up, will they still dare to touch us?" Grant shook his head gently. "When the light turns on, the darkness has to back off, but you have to keep the light on." No one in the courtyard said anything grand. They just looked at each other and saw in one another's eyes that the old familiar posture of Milford heads bowed was gone. An elderly woman with gray hair whispered, "I thought I'd die before seeing this." Someone else placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're seeing it now, and there'll be more to see." Grant stood watching them, not smiling, but the look in his eyes softened a little. He had seen many communities fall apart, many places too broken to rise again. Milford wasn't quite like those places. They were weak, they were afraid they had been crushed, but they hadn't completely lost faith. All it took was a small crack, and they'd start to lift their heads. Daisy was wheeled out into the courtyard because the doctor wanted her to get some fresh air. When she appeared, the group that had just been talking fell quiet for a few seconds, then moved toward her. A young person bent down and said, "Miss Daisy, we're with you." Daisy took her hand, her eyes misting slightly. She looked around and saw even the ones who had stayed silent yesterday, the ones who bit their lips and didn't help her out of fear, now standing straighter in front of her. She knew not all of them were brave, but they were here, and for her, that was enough. Grant stepped back, taking in the moment before jotting down a few final lines in his notebook. He knew that by tomorrow night, the day after, and in the many weeks to come, Milford's transformation wouldn't be easy. But in this moment, people retelling old stories, people standing up to discuss new plans, and people visiting someone who had once been dragged by the hair in the middle of a diner, it was the moment when a town, for the first time in many years, began to pull itself out of the dark. And to Grant, that was always the kind of beginning worth lingering for just a little longer before stepping into the next fight. The data from 5 years ago was unlocked by the federal team that afternoon once the NorthBridge server system was fully under their control. The files were recovered slowly but steadily, piece by piece, as if the secrets shoved into dark corners were now surfacing one by one. A technician called Grant over his voice low but waited. "You're going to want to see this." Grant walked to the desk, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the glowing screen in the windowless room. The words, "Recovered Archive, Year 1 to Year 5" appeared. The whole room gradually fell silent. These data sets hadn't been part of the original Millford investigation, but now that the system was fully unlocked, every year of archive storage was laid out on the table. The technician opened a few files, and instantly the maps of 3 other towns appeared: Brookhaven, Lindenport, and Ashford Creek. Each town had a list of equipment provided by NorthBridge, along with reports titled Security Optimization. Grant stared at the blinking red dots and finally understood what he had long suspected. Milford wasn't the only place NorthBridge had looped into its ring of false order. What came up wasn't just a handful of scattered reports, it was a full system. North-south, then Milford, all 3 followed the same model: irregular camera updates, missing complaints, body cams going dark at the exact wrong moment. Even the way documents were edited, the way sentences were flipped, it was all identical, as if pulled from the same template. A young investigator took a sharp breath as he opened the financial transaction logs from previous years. Jesus, they paid it out like payroll, he said, scrolling to the next page. The names of officers from the other 3 towns filled the screen, each one receiving stipends or consulting fees outside of any formal contract. The list was so long that it took constant scrolling. The notes beside each name were blunt: ensure file consistency, keep media quiet, prioritize protection of service package. Grant saw the structure clearly. This was how silence was bought, how loyalty was maintained. Not with large sums, but with steady ones, building a quiet army of mutual interest. And it wasn't just at the town level. A few names from state agencies appeared too. Not many, but enough to show that NorthBridge's reach didn't stop at local police departments. A county security director received a conference fee. A senior assistant got exceptional maintenance costs, and a former coordinator was paid every 3 months like clockwork. None of these amounts raised alarms in isolation, but when lined up with the exact moments NorthBridge won contracts in each area, they told a clearer story than any testimony ever could. Grant looked down at the map, then at each line of data. He stood still, but his mind raced like someone reconstructing the spine of a monster. What he had seen on the first night at Sunset Diner was only one small arm of it. Marcus Hall had believed he'd uncovered a few dirty emails in Milford, but the truth was he'd struck something far bigger, a network that had stretched 5 years across 3 towns and into part of the state's own infrastructure. The technician opened a video clip from Lindenport. The scene looked just like what happened in Milford. A man shoved against a wall, body cam cuts out, and the report was written wrong. Then another clip from Brookhaven showed a street camera losing signal, right as police chased down a young man who'd done nothing wrong. Each town brought up files that its people had probably once talked about, maybe cried over, but had never heard. This couldn't be called error. This was a campaign. Grant took a deep breath, not out of shock, but because it all finally fit. He stared at the screen a moment longer, then said slowly, "They used Millford as a test run. When it worked, they scaled up." The investigator beside him nodded. They copied the same model in all 3 places. If Marcus hadn't sent that hard drive, we'd need years to dig this out. Grant kept looking at the map, his fingers resting on the edge of the desk. He had seen this before, evil not as a person, but as a structure. A structure that grew on its own, swallowed the vulnerable, then cloned itself from one town to the next. It didn't need shouting to survive. It was dressed up in signatures, contracts, and meetings called security enhancements. An investigator asked, "Where do you want to start?" Grant replied without hesitation, "Millford is the first lock. We start here, then move out." He knew exactly what that meant. Once one link was pulled into the light, the other 3 towns would shake, and those who once believed they stood above the people would find themselves standing beneath the law. Grant flipped his notebook open and wrote a single short line on a new page, like marking the beginning of the next phase. Millford isn't the end. It's the open and move. He closed the notebook, stood tall, and watched the tech team continue opening the remaining folders. Each file that appeared felt like a chunk of wall breaking away, revealing what had been hidden beneath the bricks. And he understood that from this moment on, the mission wasn't to fix a single town. The mission was to uproot what had taken 5 years to spread through the system. Millford was just the first piece. The rest were waiting. The night before the trial, the hallway of the Milford County Detention Center stayed lit all night. The air felt thick like mud as those who used to scream in the faces of townspeople now sat locked in cold, holding cells, each one in a different state, each clinging to their own version of justification. All of them knew there was no turning back tomorrow, and that truth alone made the entire cell block feel like a pressure cooker about to explode. Blake Rowan was brought from solitary confinement to the pre-trial evaluation room. The moment the 2 officers escorting him opened the door, he started screaming, his voice hoarse to the point of choking. Everyone did it. Why am I the only one arrested? He slammed his shoulder against the wall, still trying to pull at his handcuffs as if he could rip them off his eyes, bloodshot and wild. They beat people even too. They faked reports too. They took the money too. Why is it just me? Why didn't you drag the whole damn station in here? No one answered him. The 2 officers only held his shoulders to keep him from slamming his head into the wall again. They used to fear him, used to bow their heads when he barked orders, used to pretend not to hear when he threatened to kill someone. But tonight, their faces were strangely calm. One officer murmured to his partner, just loud enough for Blake to hear and go further off the rails. "It's time." Blake screamed louder, his voice turning desperate. "I didn't make this up. I just followed how this town works. Why is it my turn to be the scapegoat?" But he knew no one could answer that for him anymore. In the cell next door, Damon Cross stood leaning against the wall, hands cuffed in front of him, still wearing his uniform, but it looked out of place now, like ceremonial clothing worn to a funeral. When the investigator asked what he wanted to offer before the trial, he tilted his head back and let out a dry laugh, a laugh twisted by bitterness and pride. "I just followed the contracts," he said. "Those numbers on the paper didn't appear by magic. NorthBridge delivered the gear I signed, I enforced. I didn't build this system." He kept speaking in a daze. He tried to disguise his composure. "It would have run without me. I was just the operator." The investigator across from him didn't frown or respond. He opened the file and turned to a page full of Cross's signatures on altered reports. "You also deleted citizen complaints," the investigator said. "You forced your subordinates to misreport charges. That wasn't in any contract." Cross went silent for a few seconds, his lips twitching slightly as if trying to form a rebuttal, but nothing came. He looked away, and for the first time his eyes showed real fear, the kind not aimed at the federal government, but at the fact that he no longer had a story left to hide behind. In the women's wing, Celia Thorne sat on the edge of her bed, both hands covering her face. For the first time since she was handcuffed, she let herself show what she'd hidden. All her life she cried. Not out of regret, not out of empathy, and not because the people she had thrown into pits were now rising. She cried because her power, the one she had built out of contracts' fear money, and by gripping the police by the throat, was slipping from her hands piece by piece. Her tears made no sound, but her shoulders shook with every wave. A female investigator stood outside the door saying nothing, offering no comfort. She had read dozens of Celia's emails, had seen her ignore reports of citizens being assaulted, had watched her sign off on police funding to increase effectiveness. She knew those tears didn't deserve pity. When the cell door finally closed, Celia looked up, eyes red. "They don't understand. I kept this town from falling apart." She mumbled, her voice rough, but she knew herself that those words had never been more meaningless. Luther Grant appeared at the end of the hallway, walking slowly, shoulders straight, eyes focused ahead. When he reached the junction between the 3 cell blocks, the whole area went quiet. Blake, mid-rage, stopped yelling when he saw Grant's silhouette. Cross turned his face toward him, lips pressed tight as if bracing for judgment. Celia stopped crying for a few moments, eyes drifting toward the door. Grant didn't raise his voice. He simply said, calm as earth after a storm, "Everyone had a choice. You chose wrong." Blake let out a shaky laugh, edged with despair. "Choice? What kind of choice do you think we had in this town?" Grant looked at him for a few seconds like someone looking at a child who still didn't understand why he'd fallen. "Choice is what you made every time you picked up a pen to sign, every time you hit someone who hadn't done anything wrong, every time you treated people like garbage. Don't use Milford to justify yourself. The mistakes are yours." Cross turned away, eyes fixed on the floor, his face suddenly looking 10 years older. Celia gripped the edge of the bed tight, like someone trying to hold on to something she already knew was lost. Blake slid down the wall of his cell, screaming one last time into the night. "I was set up. I wasn't the only one in on this." Grant didn't respond, because that line didn't need a response. He turned around and walked out of the hallway like a man who had just closed the final chapter of a long, rotten book. Tomorrow, the trial would begin, and the people who once held the law in their hands would now stand before it with their hands in cuffs. The night before the trial, Milford was no longer noisy. Each person in detention sank into their own private fear. And Grant, as he stepped into the parking lot, just looked up at the night sky. He knew that tomorrow's hearing wasn't just about punishment. It was Milford finally looking at itself in the mirror for the first time in many, many years. On the day the trial began, Milford held its breath for a second time. People lined up outside the county courthouse, crowding the cold concrete steps, trying to glimpse what was happening inside. Everyone knew this was the deciding day, the day when the names that had once made the whole town bow their heads would have to stand before the judge. No more badges, no more titles, no more protection, only the law and consequences. Daisy Moore was brought in as the main witness. She wore her familiar purple blouse this time with a thin scarf draped over her shoulders, a gift from a local woman earlier that morning. As she entered the courtroom, she walked slowly to keep her balance hands slightly trembling, but her eyes were brighter than anyone had ever seen them. She sat in the witness chair, placed her hands on her lap, and took a long breath. The lawyer asked the first question. "Can you describe what happened that night at the Sunset Diner?" Daisy looked toward the courtroom gallery. Her gaze met a few townspeople gently nodding silently, sending her strength. She began to speak, her voice steady, but breaking at moments as old fear still clung to each word. "I was working." Blake knocked over the coffee cup. Then he grabbed my hair. I couldn't even get a word out. He threatened me, said he'd kill me if I looked at him. Daisy paused, her eyes red, but she sat straighter as she spoke the part she had waited years to say. I don't remember how I even kept breathing. I just remember the door opened, and I heard someone say, "Let her go." The courtroom was silent, so quiet that the sound of a pen falling onto a clerk's notepad could be heard. Daisy bowed her head slightly, then finished with the words she had held in for years. I endured it for too long, but that night, I knew I didn't have to anymore. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was packed. People filled the aisles and the hall outside. Grant stood in the back, not pushing forward, not seeking attention. He stood as a witness, his eyes scanning every face as the judge prepared to read the verdicts. Blake Rowan was brought out first. He bit his lip, eyes darting, still searching for someone in the room to side with him. But silence was all that met him. The judge looked at the file and spoke clearly. Defendant Blake Rowan for the charges of assault, abuse of power, falsifying reports, and threats of lethal violence. The court sentences you to 22 years in prison with no parole. Blake shouted, "No way, they did it too." Why just me? But his voice was drowned out by the sound of handcuffs snapping shut. A few people in the room closed their eyes, not out of sympathy, but because they were watching someone who once stood over them now being led away. Next was Damon Cross. He no longer carried the posture of a police chief, always puffing his chest, but walked with slumped shoulders, his eyes hollow like a dark pit. The judge read, "For charges of bribery, directing the destruction of complaints, abuse of authority, and systemic cover-ups. The court sentences you to 30 years in prison." A soft, "Oh my God," slipped from someone in the back row, an old man once pulled over by Cross in the heat of summer the year before. Cross simply closed his eyes, breathing like an old man, knowing every rung he had climbed was now ashes. Celia Thorne was last. Her hands were cuffed, but her shoulders stayed straight, like the final remnants of a power now lost. When the judge read the verdict for charges of data, tampering evidence destruction, unlawful payments to law enforcement, and endangering public safety, the court sentences you to 25 years in prison and a permanent ban from holding any executive position. Celia didn't object, didn't scream, didn't beg. She bowed her head, not in guilt, but knowing that from this moment on, NorthBridge was no longer her empire. As soon as Celia's sentence was read, the back door of the courtroom opened. A young man stepped inside, shoulders, narrow eyes darkened from many sleepless nights, but still carrying something alive, the kind of spark the town thought it had lost. Murmurs spread. Someone whispered, "Marcus, that's Marcus." Daisy raised a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. Marcus Hall, the one who sent the hard drive, who vanished the night before he was supposed to meet Grant, stood before the court, his steps steady, like he was proving he truly existed. Grant looked at Marcus, his eyes softening for a beat, and gave a small nod. Marcus nodded back, simple and quiet, but everyone in the room understood the meaning. A man they thought was buried had returned to testify, to close the circle he had opened with his final message. The judge didn't wait for the room to settle before reading the last verdict, the heaviest one not meant for a person, but for the organization behind it all. The court rules NorthBridge Security Solutions is hereby permanently stripped of its license, all assets frozen and banned from operating in any security-related field under federal jurisdiction. For a few seconds, the courtroom went completely silent, as if all the air had been sucked out. Then came a long exhale, not of exhaustion, but of people witnessing a dark wall torn down in the broad daylight. No one clapped. No one cheered. They just stood, a little taller, breathed a little deeper, as if for the first time in years, the air in Millford was truly light. Daisy looked toward the benches where Grant stood. He nodded, not just at her, but as if to let the whole town know that this had reached the place it was meant to. She smiled faintly, then turned back to the judge, to the light falling through the window, and for the first time in her life, whispered the words she had never dared to say, "Millford still has a chance." Heavy snow fell the next afternoon, covering the walkways around the military cemetery 3 miles outside Millford. Luther Grant pulled his car over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and stood still for a few seconds in the wind, carrying the sharp chill of late winter. He wasn't a man who gave much time to emotion, but that afternoon made him stop. What had happened in Millford had closed one chapter, but inside him another had opened a chapter of memories so deep that no matter how far down he buried them, the snow still managed to dig them up. He stepped into the cemetery, his boots sinking lightly into the snow. The white headstones were lined up straight, like a silent, steadfast army standing their ground, no matter how many years passed or how many footsteps faded away. Grant walked between the rows unhurried, letting his eyes land on each engraved name, some of which he knew better than his own. There was Marcus Hale, the black soldier who once saved Grant's unit in Kabul, but was denied a medal for being ineligible under award standards at the time. There was Franklin Boyd, a scout treated like a nameless rookie, even though he was the only one who held the Southern Mountain Post for 2 straight days. Grant stood before each grave, quietly reading their names in a low voice, as if calling out to those who had never truly been acknowledged. Snow swept across his face, but Grant didn't raise a hand to brush it away. He let it fall as a reminder of those comrades who hadn't died from enemies in front of them, but from the prejudice behind them. He remembered one night in Syria when a young lieutenant said, "A black man can't be a team leader," and the very next day asked him to lead the raid. He remembered a fellow soldier injured in Iraq who came home only to be treated by local police like a criminal because he fit a suspect description. One memory triggered another, a chain longer than any battle he had ever fought. Grant stopped in front of a headstone with nothing but a name. Buried there was Clarence Woods, his first friend in the Navy. Clarence had taught him how to fight, how to read maps, how to survive beyond the unit, but was killed in a bar fight back home because a cop thought he looked suspicious. Grant reached out and touched the headstone, not to wipe away the snow, but to anchor himself against the anger rising in his chest. He knew that the victory in Millford didn't erase any of this. It couldn't bring Clarence back. It couldn't give justice to those who'd been stopped on their own streets. It couldn't heal the wounds the system had carved over decades. Grant understood clearly the fight he had just won was only a sliver. Behind it stood a wall built from generations of injustice. The wind picked up, flipping the edge of his coat. Grant exhaled slowly, standing among the white headstones like he was standing among the people watching him from the other side. "I did what I could," he said softly. His voice didn't shake but carried a weariness few had ever seen in him. "But I know it's not over." He bowed his head in respect, then turned and walked back toward the car. The road out of the cemetery was covered deep in snow, the tire tracks trailing beneath leafless trees. As Grant neared his vehicle, he noticed something on the windshield, a black envelope resting neatly atop the fresh snow. No one else was around. The road was empty, as if no one had visited the cemetery all day. Grant paused in front of the car, looking at the envelope like a sign he had always expected would come only sooner than he thought. He picked it up and flipped it over. No sender's name, no symbols, no stamps, just the faint mark of a fingerprint pressed onto the envelope before the snow fell, proving whoever left it hadn't gone far. Grant opened it right there, hands, steady eyes, calm, as if he were starting another operation. Inside was a cream-colored sheet of paper, clean and sharp with no extra words, just a single typed line. "You've only reached the first layer." Grant read it, eyes narrowing slightly, not out of surprise, but because he knew this wasn't a threat and it wasn't a warning. It was the truth, the kind he had sensed from the moment those 5-year-old files appeared on screen. Millford was just the entry point. Behind it were more layers, more towns, more untouched records no one had dared to open. He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket. The sky above the cemetery had gone grayer, the snow falling heavier, but Grant stood there a moment longer, looking out over the rows of white headstones fading into the snowy mist. No one heard what he said next, but no one needed to. He already knew the direction of his next steps, and the ghosts standing in that cemetery, old comrades, overlooked black soldiers. Those buried beneath silence seemed to be right behind him, waiting for him to move on to the next layer of the truth. Snow was still falling when Luther Grant stood beside his car, sealing the black envelope with a line of words as sharp as a blade. "You've only touched the first layer." The sentence lay still on paper, but its weight echoed across the cemetery, a reminder that the battle he had stepped into didn't end in Millford, and what he had just been through was only the beginning of something deeper, wider, dirtier. Grant tucked the envelope into his coat pocket, his eyes fixed on the road leading out of the cemetery. A long, white line stretched into the distance as if inviting him forward into the darkness he had yet to enter. He opened the car door but didn't get in right away. Grant turned and looked back toward Millford, resting quietly in the valley, its rooftops dusted with snow looking small beneath the sky. He had seen this town gripped by fear, watched its people lower their heads when police walked by, seen the look in Daisy Moore's eyes as she tried to hide bruises on her wrist under the sleeve of her purple blouse. But this morning, though the snow was heavy and the sky was gray, Millford felt different. The air was lighter. The rooftops no longer seemed crushed. The road leading to the courthouse looked brighter, like it had finally taken a breath after years of holding it in. Grant knew the town had changed. Not necessarily better, not immediately safer, but it was standing straighter. The people had spoken their truth. They had seen the ones who hurt them in handcuffs. They had nodded to one another as they left the courtroom. That change hadn't come from him. It had come from them. People who had been silenced for too long are finally realizing they have the right to speak loudly. Grant didn't smile, but there was a rare softness in his eyes. He knew what had happened in Millford would leave a marker for the next generation, but he also understood one thing. Clearly, the dark shadow that once blanketed this town hadn't disappeared. It had only stepped back a few paces. He looked at Millford for a few more seconds, as if trying to memorize the image of a town in transition. Then he turned, stepped into the car, and closed the door. The engine came to life with a low hum, its sound steady in the snowy stillness. Grant placed his hands on the steering wheel, his fingers brushing the worn leather at the edge, his usual resting point when he was about to head into something new. He didn't need a map. He knew where he was going, not because the envelope gave directions, but because the word's first layer had shown him how deep this ran. The engine shifted gears. The tires rolled slowly out of the lot. The road ahead was so white it nearly blended into the sky. Grant drove downhill the rear wheels, leaving deep tracks in the snow-covered ground. As the car passed through a line of trees, the snowfall grew heavier, layering a fresh sheet across the windshield. Grant didn't turn on the music or the radio. He let the sound of the engine guide him, let his own breath settle into the silence of the afternoon. A little further down the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Millford was shrinking in the distance now, just a faint mark in the white valley. But Grant kept looking because he knew that what had happened there would be the map for the places he was heading toward. Places where NorthBridge existed in different forms. Places with different versions of Cross, with other daisies still enduring in silence. Places where the darkness didn't need to shout or show itself because it had already woven into every layer of the system like roots buried deep in soil. Grant turned his eyes back to the road, gripping the wheel just a little tighter. The gray sky opened up in front of him like a bottomless well, and he knew he was about to enter the cold again, a cold full of secrets and people who believed they could never be exposed. But he also knew why he had to keep going. There were places where people couldn't protect themselves, and if he didn't show up, no one else would. The wind picked up along the roadside, bare branches rattling like voices calling from far away. Grant thought of Marcus Hall of the data from 5 years ago of the other 3 towns still waiting somewhere on the map, each marked with a red dot that had yet to be revealed. He thought of the black envelope of the message with no name, but full of a truth deeper than any court could sentence in a single day. As the car passed Millford's boundary, Grant spoke a sentence not for anyone else, but for himself. A sentence he always said after each battle. A sentence he knew would stay with him until the day he could no longer stand. Where justice is trampled, I will show up again, and his car disappeared into the snow, heading straight into the next layer of darkness that waited.